Good morning and good afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar on AI in low and middle income countries. My name is Sam Ajadi. I'm a Senior Insights Manager at GSMA. In terms of the agenda for the next hour, so I would first deliver a presentation on our recent findings on AI and startups in low and middle income countries. I'll then hand over to my colleague Akanksha, who will chair a panel discussion, and she would also introduce our esteemed panelists. Before we dive in, please allow me to do some quick housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please do post them in a question box, which should be found on the right side of your screen. We want this session to be as interactive as possible, so please do keep the questions coming, and I will be able to direct the questions to the right speakers as we progress with the presentation. Next slide, please. So before we kick off, I would like to thank the UK Aid for funding this research on AI, and I would also like to thank GSMA members for their continued support as well with this research. Next slide. But for those not familiar with the GSMA, so we are an industry body for mobile operators, uniting more than 750 mobile operators with nearly 400 companies in the broader mobile ecosystem. So typically our work stream can be grouped into three. So the first one, we have a number of industry programs which really helps to set the pace for the mobile industry in terms of like topics such as developing future networks, managing digital identity, and mobilizing the Internet of Things. The second kind of streams of work that we focus on is our convening initiatives, and so we work on online and physical events. Some of you might be familiar with our Mobile World Congress event, which runs every year. This year, because of COVID-19, we've pivoted our focus slightly to our online events. So we had our Thrive, GSMA Thrive events across a number of our regions, including Africa, LATAM, China. And so these are some of the initiatives we've done, and increasingly, hopefully when things go back to normal, we'll be able to meet physically. And finally, the initiatives we have within our advocacy initiative, which really focuses on tackling some of the world's most pressing challenges. So we convene private and public sectors together to really transform the lives, the lives of people, and we focus on mobile innovation. In terms of actually our advocacy initiatives, I'll quickly focus on our Mobile for Development arm. We have about 10 different programs within this part of the organization, and essentially we focus on the different ways in which mobile technology is having a phenomenal impact on people's lives. We have projects in about 45 countries. We're working with mobile operators, we're working with innovators, not-for-profits, civic society, all of this to help drive action and really unearth new innovation. So to the research, earlier this year we conducted a research looking at the landscape of AI and startups in low and middle income countries. We selected a sampling of 450 AI startups across Africa and Asia. So our focus was Africa, South Asia, and the Asia and Southeast Asia region. We conducted 23 key informant interviews with AI experts and practitioners, and this included entrepreneurs, donor organizations, some of the project beneficiaries that we have within our innovation fund here at the GSMA, and all this really to get a detailed understanding of actually what are the activities around AI in developing countries. But what we also did with this is we wanted to understand what are some of the business models, what are some of the ethical considerations and barriers to scaling and deploying AI solutions in these markets. Next slide, please. So the first thing that we picked up, we worked very closely with Urban Emerge on this research, and Urban Emerge is a sustainable, inclusive development consultancy which focuses on emerging markets. And you will be hearing from Andreas, who's the managing partner and co-founder of Urban Emerge in the panel. So we are looking at this. One of the big trends that we picked up is that the number of activities. We realized that actually India had the highest percentage in terms of number of innovative startups focusing on AI. And after India, Nigeria and South Africa also ranked quite highly on this. And the reason, maybe I'll single out India here, is that we see that there's more of a top-down approach where really the governments have really prioritized AI solution as a key part of the economic development. We've also seen that there's a lot of increasingly, you're seeing an increase in workforce, AI workforce in the country, and these are just some of the things that point us to the activities that we're seeing. As I noted, South Africa and Nigeria also ranked highly in Africa. One thing to also note that we saw in Kenya is that last year the government actually released initiatives really to help put AI at the forefront of what the development of the country. And so this is also key. And I think some of the big trends that we're seeing with countries that have increasing activity within AI, countries that prioritizes AI, we see that actually there's an increase in the region, in the government's activity. You've seen that there's an increase in focus of STEM education as well. And we'll explore this theme later as well. Next slide, please. So when breaking down the use cases per sector, we found that business intelligence and analytics was a clear leader. As you can see, there's 142 use cases, and these capture solutions from accounting solutions to like decision making to customer, for customer service. Following that is healthcare. We see that healthcare, from sophisticated sort of diagnostic solutions and hospital management system to a solution like Curacell, and you'll be hearing from Innocent, who's a chief data scientist on the panel. So these types of solutions we've come across in healthcare, and following that we see food and agriculture. There are activities there, use cases there, financial services, education, and retail and consumer goods. Next slide, please. So when we broke down the sector by SDGs, we found that SDG 8 and 9, so decent work and economic growth, and industry, SDG 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure, came after on top. We also saw that there's a strong focus on food and agriculture, so SDG 1 and 2, particularly in relation to reducing poverty reduction and climate smart agriculture. So move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So looking at the capabilities of AI, what we saw came out on top was deep learning platforms were the most common. followed by decision management. And both of these are used by startups who are really seeking to gain insights from big data and sort of gain a greater edge in terms of meeting the needs of their customers. We also see that businesses and startups are using these solutions to respond to customer feedback more effectively and efficiently. Following that is computer vision. And this is also linked to deep learning. It often involves image recognition processes in diagnostics, and we've seen this in healthcare, in agriculture as well. It is also an important tool for that is making use of sort of mobile technology to identify products, to read text for persons with visual impairments, for example. Virtual agents came in fourth, and this include solutions such as chatbots, and which is used in a wide range of applications, from customer services to advise on sort of health-related issues. So we'll move on to the next slide. So it's in terms of the funding use cases. We saw that the key sectors that came out on top were financial services, food and agriculture, health and business, intelligence and analytics. And some of the references that we've noted down here is in food and agriculture, for instance, Twiga Foods in Kenya, raised $30 million US dollars. Cropping in India has raised $13.5 million. We have a company in Malaysia, Domacan, has raised $27 million. But we have more detail on the funding use cases in the report, so please do explore this. Next slide, please. Then looking at the opportunities for AI and in fighting against COVID-19, we came across a number of sort of trends and use cases on this front. One, we've seen that the disruption of COVID-19 has led governments, companies, and other organizations to seek to quickly and speedily digitize solutions. We've seen governments automating part of their COVID-19 responses. We've seen the deployment of distance learning systems as a result of COVID-19. We've seen actually the importance of a secure local food supply and contingency planning also in this period. I think generally the crisis will likely still stimulate faster changes in AI technology than previously envisaged. I think governments will really need to work hard to ensure that innovators really have the best chance to participate in this rapid shift in the fourth industrial revolution. Next slide, please. So as part of this research, we also looked at the business model. Monetization is obviously a critical component of any business model. And we really were able to group these companies that we looked at into two. So first, we looked at the companies that are AI enabled. And these are the companies that their revenue streams are mostly, they resemble traditional software companies. And so you have a typical SaaS model, software as a service. You have a transaction fee, they collect transaction fee. They're using an advertising model or revenue model. So typically, these companies, as I said, they resemble a traditional software company, but they tend to also generate their revenue using a multi-revenue stream approach where they combine a mixture of monetization avenues. The second types of companies, I said, is AI-first companies. And these are companies that often have an AI as a service platform as their unique proposition. And I mean, whilst basically AI business model is still a trial and error, and will continue to evolve, particularly for this business model, we see that these companies really take a unique approach where they are AI first, and they serve AI as a service. What we found is that AI enabled companies, the B2C model is more common here. And this is due to the higher upfront investments for AI first companies. AI first companies tend to be B2B or B2G companies. And yeah, so that's kind of the big trend that we see. When it comes to this consumer segment, we've seen the big focus on, B2C. Startups are active across these segments, from business to consumer to business to business to business to government. The companies and the sampling are active across these different areas. In terms of outlook, which we also looked at when considering the business model, there are key things to look out for. So one, where the regulatory environment is one. We also need to look at the key industry trends. With the regulatory environment, we see the companies revealed that some of the questions they're being asked were that who will really own the IP on their data, on consumer data? Because consumers are asking, will their data be sold without any authorization? They ask questions around how will the data be collected? What degree of anonymity do the companies provide? And how would the data be stored? So there really is a lot of questions here. And what we found is that actually, when it comes to the regulatory environment and the ethics, there's still a lot that needs to be done across these areas in developing markets. Next slide, please. So on that note, we'll focus on the barriers and challenges that we came across on these fronts. And let's look at the barriers. The first, really, the availability, accessibility, and quality of data was an issue. When you look at these markets, the markets which we focused on, AI and machine learning applications particularly need really data to develop and train effective algorithms. And in less digitized environments like the regions we're focused on, there is comparatively less data available, and also less effective data practices. And this means that data is usually held by companies and other organizations. These data are usually uneven or inaccessible for many of these companies. The other point is on human capital and education. Even when we look at the more developed AI country within our sampling frame, which is India, you still see that there's a real need for more homegrown talents and skilled AI development talents. And for that, it's one of the bigger challenges facing some of these countries, where from skills needed for preparing data, training machine learning, launching and maintaining new apps and solutions, there's a real need for developing this talent pool. On the investment landscape, we've seen that there's really still a need for that. This is really a barrier for many of the companies that we spoke to, where they're looking to develop their solution, scale a solution, but there's a lack of investment available for them. In terms of ethics, ethical considerations, I think whilst AI holds significant potential for good, there are some ethical considerations that must be considered not to cause harm. There are many ethical questions about data protection, ingrained biases, poor data collection methods, social inclusion, and really the responsible use of AI. it is really crucial that AI solutions should be ethical by design, and to be guided by sound privacy principles, to prevent and mitigate any negative impact to both users, workers, and really the community and environment at large. So here are some of the ethical principles that we've noted here. In GSMA, in the reports, you see details of GSMA's ethical principles. We've noted the importance of, that it needs to be inclusive, that AI stakeholders should ensure that the benefits of their AI-based technologies are accessible, to be fair. AI should really incorporate human oversight. Data must be accurate and not biased. AI that makes unfair and discriminatory decisions should not be used. It should also ensure transparency, where individuals should be informed when they're communicating with AI-powered systems instead of humans. And so, for instance, they should be informed when they're communicating with chatbots. Also, decisions made with AI should really be explainable to impacted individuals. So the next point, it should really embed accountability. So all AI stakeholders should be accountable for their use of AI and should promote these principles with third parties. It should adopt privacy and ethics by design, as I said earlier. It should advance security and safety. It should support sustainability and social well-being as well. And so I'll move on to our next point. So we've touched on briefly what we found in the reports. There's so much insights that we can unpack, but we will keep this short so that we can pass this over to our panel. And with that said, here's the report. There's a QR code on the side, and there's a link. There's a bit.ly link where you can download the report. Please do check it out, and please, if you're interested, if you have any questions, do reach out to us directly. We can also follow up on the chat as well. We can provide more details for you. On that note, I'll pass it over to Kansha Sharma, who's my colleague, and should be able to take us through the panel. Kansha is interim senior director at Central Insights Unit at GSMA. Over to you, Kansha.
Thank you, Sam, and hello, everyone. Sam has already introduced me, so I don't need to introduce myself. For the next half of the session, we will hear from a panel of experts, and I will be doing the oh-so-tough job of asking questions. And in order to answer those questions, we have with us three panelists today. First up, we have Anthony Herman, who is the head of emerging technology and deputy head of FCDO's Emerging Policy, Innovation and Capability Department, which they call EPIC in short. EPIC. EPIC promotes innovation, digital and emerging technologies to accelerate development impact. Anthony has also worked in a range of roles in the UK civil services. Most recently, he was an advisor on the innovation and strategy for international development. Welcome, Anthony. I think we'll have the videos up in a moment. But before that, we have Innocent Udiegu, who works as a chief data scientist at Curacell. And last but not the least, we have Andreas Bieber, who is the co-founder of Urban Emerge, which is a research consultancy that led on this project, amongst many other projects that they've previously worked on with FCDO, ADB, the World Bank, Global Green Growth Institute, and many others. So welcome, everyone. I'd request you all to switch on your videos, and we'll probably get started. I think let me give you a background on the on the inception of this piece. So we, the GSMA, are part of an AI working group, which is run by the International Development Innovation Alliance, IDIA, the members of which are many global and aid agencies and UN bodies, World Bank, etc. In one of the conversations in the working group, we discussed the need to have a landscaping document, essentially covering the very many AI innovations that we have out there in the low and middle income countries. Usually we get, the companies that are most known come from developed markets. There's not enough information on what's happening in the low and middle income countries, what's working, what's not, what sort of business models are being used. So this research essentially is this came out of those discussions, and we took on the research due to those reasons. And at that point, from FCDO, we were working very closely with Alex Jones, who Anthony, as you might know, was your predecessor. And so my first question is to you, Anthony. Now that you're reading it as somebody who's recently stepped into the role and as a third person who's just seeing the output, what are your reflections on the report? And also, I'll add one more question to just beyond the reflections. Are there any areas where you thought, more research is needed in the future? Maybe we can get started from there.
Great, thank you, and good morning, everyone. So I think this report shows the real breadth and variety of applications in AI in developing countries, which in a way is unsurprising given many of us see AI as a general purpose technology, which means it's something that will have impacts that reach far beyond individual use cases and will actually has the potential to transform societies and economies. So the fact that we see such a breadth of different use cases emerging in developing countries could be interpreted as the early stages of what is likely to be quite a transformational journey. And the question that we ask ourselves in FCDO when we look at analysis like this is what role can we play to help maximize the opportunities and minimize the risks of this transformation in developing countries? And I think the report highlights some really interesting opportunities and risks. I think on the opportunity side, I think development challenges are usually complicated and sometimes complex. And I would argue in AI's real promise is in its ability to tackle complexity. In a world where the work that we do it's in volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environments, causal pathways are numerous, their interactions are not straightforward. Machine learning techniques can help to spot weak signals, large amounts of data, identify patterns that we as human observers would not otherwise be able to see, and help give us clues and identify patterns about how we can achieve certain outcomes. And this is where we see some of the really cutting edge research in AI taking us, things like just the other week, DeepMind's mapping of protein structures. So my takeaway from looking at this is that many of the use cases in the report are of AI helping to solve problems that are complicated and in a few cases also complex. I think many of these, the things around optimizing learning content for people's needs in the edtech space, the driving of logistical efficiencies and supply chains and deliveries, speeding up diagnosis of health conditions. These are all really important, and it shows that this opportunity space in finding efficiencies and working through complicated problems is enormous in developing countries. Relatively fewer of the case studies so far seem to be looking at kind of complex systems level challenges, things like gender-based violence, corruption, climate change. And these are obviously much more wicked problems, much more difficult for an individual private sector startup to address. And these are probably areas where a more of a mission-oriented approach with public and private sector working closely together, developing country governments taking a strategic interest, civil society playing a role, research and academia also getting involved. That sort of approach might be a way to kind of move into the next level in terms of tackling really complex development challenges. And on the risks side, I think the report shows that, it highlights some really important risks around exacerbating inequalities, around the risk of excluding people, and much of this comes across in the way that the data that feeds AI approaches is structured and how inclusive that data is. I'd also add misuse is a real risk here, though we know that many emerging AI applications are kind of dual use in nature. They can be used for repression or for targeted surveillance, as well as for beneficial uses outlined in the report. And so we need to be really careful as we approach in this space. And I think that's why the points that Sam was making around the regulatory environment and the wider innovation ecosystems is really crucial points. We need to reflect on what are the values and norms that are emerging, and how can we support innovation ecosystems to embed values and norms of inclusivity, of privacy by design, and these sorts of things. And these are questions that every country is grappling with. We grapple with these in the UK and in developed economies as well as in emerging markets. And that's why I think, as development practitioners, we need to really work closely with diplomacy, with our own domestic digital ministries and agencies, stay on top of the emerging debates and best practices here, and use that to really inform our work in international development. And that's what we're aiming to do in Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And one of the opportunities we have really now being brought together with diplomacy and development in the same department. So those were just a few reflections I wanted to share, and I'll leave it there and hand over to my colleagues.
That's really interesting, and that's kind of set the tone for the discussion. Andreas, Anthony highlighted a few interesting applications. When we started off this research, and as we do with all research pieces, we go with a set of assumptions. We go with a sort of a hypothesis, expecting certain things to happen. And then during the research, there are some striking findings that we come across. So I'd like to hear from you the interesting observations that you've had during this research, which Sam might not have shared in the presentation, but would be good for our audiences to hear.
Yeah, thank you very much, Akanksha, and good morning to everyone. I think one of the key things that we found through the research is just that there's so much homegrown innovation starting to take off in many developing countries across Asia and Africa. And that's really down to a few key things around access to lower cost kind of cloud computing, access to more off-the-shelf software and AI APIs, and also just a really dynamic kind of tech environment. So a lot of young people who are very literate in ICT and developing digital solutions. So to actually develop a kind of machine learning process from first principles is very cost and time intensive. But when you can actually draw on a lot of off-the-shelf tools that are now available, then that can really speed things up. And we're seeing that very, very much across some of these key countries that Sam mentioned. The second point is there's a huge thinkability to help meet some of the Sustainable Development Goal challenges with many of these solutions, even if the people developing them aren't really kind of aiming to do that as their primary goal. If they're working on something in healthcare, or if they're working on something around person-to-person trading of renewable energy that's been generated on somebody's solar panel on their roof using AI and maybe blockchain, or if they're thinking about just kind of better logistics for supply chains and connecting rural farmers with urban markets, then they're really helping to solve a lot of quite critical development challenges that are holding things back in many places. So that was really a great insight that we found so many of these examples happening, and that they're happening. They're not kind of being imported from elsewhere. They're homegrown kind of solutions that are being developed in the context that they're needed.
Do you think, like, I'm going to ask a more quirky question. Do you think this, the use of AI is just for the sake of it, because that then generates more investment, or just sounds good, or is it did you find that a lot of providers actually used it because there was a real need to use these solutions?
No, I think in most cases, certainly in our sample of 450 use cases, there is a real need. To give you one example, there's a company in South Africa called Harambee, and they match job opportunities with the kind of profiles of appropriate candidates, and it's really helping to make the kind of search for jobs much more efficient between employers and employees in South Africa. Or there are other examples around agriculture where farmers have access to kind of customized data about local conditions and how they can manage their crops. That's suddenly opening a huge, vast kind of resource to them that they didn't have before. So it really is adding a lot, I think, to the information and the services that are available to people.
You were adding something else, Andres. I think I cut you short, but please go ahead if there's more that you wanted to share.
Yeah, no, I think the final point I was going to make there was really about the practicalities of AI as well. So if a lot of solutions are developed to rely on, say, 4G mobile or the latest kind of operating system on a mobile phone, then it's often not very accessible to a lot of people in developing countries. So one of the things we found was that developers really need to think about how to make things more accessible to all. So solutions that can maybe work offline and online, so that they can sync when people come into contact with 4G or Wi-Fi, or thinking about how you can run programs on operating systems that may be a bit old. Many mobile phones are a bit older and have kind of more limited capabilities. And also thinking about e-literacy and how your solutions can kind of be accessible to a whole range of people who may not be very used to using computers or apps or anything like that. So that's the other thing that we kind of wanted to highlight from our research as well.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I mean, next up, Innocent, my question is to you. You've seen things on the ground. You must have seen the growth of AI solutions in Africa closely. According to you, what's the state of AI in the region, particularly in terms of health and insurtech? What sort of challenges do you see?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I would say in general, the sector here, or the space here, is very nascent. Most part, things are just emerging. We are just in the early phase of seeing, AI being applied to problems. There are a few challenges that made this so. Just the first one, just being that most of the AI research, like we know, most of the AI research we see today that has been productionized. This research, they are not happening here. They mostly happen abroad. So in terms of people getting to know about AI, mostly comes from some of the media and news articles we see now about AI doing this and that. The second one is data, the availability of data. So in a society or an economy where most of the systems are not digitized, you will find it very difficult to actually do AI, because one of the premise for doing AI is that you have enough data. Take, for example, Curacao. Initially, when we started like an EMR solution to provide data entry for businesses before we voted to like trying to solve what we consider as like one of their biggest problems, which is like fraud detection in claims management. So first of all, is like there's this issue of data availability and systems to actually collect data. Right? We don't. A lot of businesses are still not digitized. So a lot of the projects we see currently is like businesses trying to digitize their process, which is like the first leg of it before you get into, okay, now you have data that is digitized. Now you can start thinking of applying AI. But it also presents an opportunity to actually leapfrog, some of the challenges I believe other developed countries faced. So if you think about it, there was this era where you have digitization happening, everything is in the database, and now, in developed countries, we are now applying, machine learning techniques to get insights or do accurate predictions. So I think the opportunities that exist now is like, okay, how can you design data collection processes better in such a way you can actually collect all the data you need, right? In a way that is easily cleaned, in a way that you can, that is more inclusive. So I usually tell people that now you have, AWS and these Google platforms that provide cheap storage. It makes sense to design systems that can collect, data, much data, like not just collect tabular data, collect sound data, collect, pictures. If you can collect pictures, if you can collect videos, because there's an opportunity to capture data the right way now, because we are kind of leapfrogging the problem we have.
And linked to that, collecting more data is the issue around biases that are inherent in the data itself. Or you're just thinking about, I'm thinking more on the lines of privacy by design. How are companies thinking about tackling that issue?
Yes. So I think for most part, if you think about regulatory framework for data privacy and what have you, they are mostly startup driven. So for example, because we don't have the framework in terms of legal framework for those things currently, mostly we have this approach where when it becomes a problem, the government decides to like create a regulatory framework around it. Right, that is the first. I think we've learned the hard lessons of collecting biased data. We've learned that we've seen that happen with face recognition, for instance, and I think people have learned the hard lessons about that. So the way I think about it, there are just three ways: collecting the right data. The second one is like research that attempts to use small amount of data that is available. So, for example, in deep learning, few shot techniques, for example, transfer learning, for example. So these are techniques that leverage small amount of data, but also use pre-trained models from that has been trained on millions amount of data, for example. So these are like this is like two techniques. The first one is just making sure you're collecting the right amount of the right data in terms of like from the source, and the second is making sure that if it's possible to use a small amount of data to actually accomplish something, what will the product look like? What would that framework look like?
Yeah. Thanks, Innocent. Andres, do you want to chip in on that point around ethics and privacy?
Yeah, it was we looked into this in quite a lot of detail. And there are lots of things that developers should be doing to make sure that ethics is really built into an AI or a machine learning solution. Data is obviously the key thing. So making sure that the data you have actually is representative of the kind of context that you're trying to reflect and provide decision management or other solutions in. And then there are things about kind of making sure that users are confident that they understand how the the service is coming to the decision that it's coming to. So transparency of what's going on kind of within the process, and also the kind of how the company is making sure that the use or the I guess the maintenance of the system is being updated to reflect actual changes in society as well. So you may kind of train a data set 1 year and then you can't kind of keep on using that indefinitely. You have to keep on updating it to reflect reality. So things like that are very important to consider as well. Yeah, I'll stop there. I'm sure others have comments on ethics too.
Yeah. Would anyone else want to chip in, or
I just also flag the emerging trend on federated learning models, which is something that's coming out of the health sector and growth of AI applications there, whereby data doesn't need to be exchanged. It's kind of an alternative to the centralized machine learning format, and it does offer quite a lot of opportunity to address considerations like privacy. And this is really kind of quite emerging. Seems that there are more and more successful examples of this being applied, and that's a really interesting trend to track, I think, in this question of privacy.
We did come across in our research some very interesting initiatives by UNESCO to develop kind of AI guidelines particularly for the developing world, and they should be released later, early next year, I think. So there's a lot of work going on in this space to really understand AI ethics from the point of view of low and middle income countries, which is a really interesting kind of thing to keep a lookout for. I think there are lots of different bodies and lots of different opinions, but it's quite hard to get a really global consensus, I think, on what's the best way to move forward and how certain machine learning systems should be aligned with different principles. But the UNESCO team are trying to bring all of this together. So yeah, I'd urge everyone who's interested to look at that.
Yeah, and the GSMA have also looked at this topic. So we've kind of applied the existing laws and regulations and privacy principles into what we've termed as GSMA mobile privacy principles, and kind of pull them together. I mean, this is included in the report, by the way. So if you guys would want to read more about it, it's all there. But again, as you guys said, it's the learning process. When a new technology comes in, it takes time for regulators to react to things and build safeguards around it. So we're all learning, and it's also fast moving. So there's this urgency to act quickly. Particularly in low and middle income countries, where sometimes the end users, not sometimes, most often the end users are not even aware of what's happening with their data. Just the topic of consent. So it's priority, especially, and I've seen this with the donors as well. It's a key concern as to when we are funding solutions like these. How do where does the onus lie? Who's responsible for ensuring that certain things are in place before the funding goes, or these solutions are supported. Thank you. I mean, thanks to all three of you. Really, really good points here. I think before we wrap up, I'd like to hear more on the prospects of future, and how do you see, which sectors, what type of solutions, where do you see that there's most opportunity in AI over the next 5 years? Maybe, Innocent, we can get started with you. I mean, in your experience, beyond the sectors that you are currently catering to or including them, where do you see the most opportunity in future?
Yeah, so I think for most part, it starts with where we already have data. And in healthcare, just because we have silos of data that has been lying there over the years, it's easier thinking about, like different opportunities, different problems AI can solve in healthcare. Think of diagnostics, right? Quick diagnostics, that instead of using invasive methods, uses parameters you can get from the body. Is it camera? Is it sound? So one interesting example is a startup with Benwa that uses the cry of the cry of a baby, be able to tell if the baby has a disease or not. And I think there are different versions of that I've seen elsewhere, where for most parts, it's just using the available data. So I think there are huge opportunity for healthcare. Also, I think fintech, just because also that space is being priced a lot now. So things like credit rating, companies trying to determine who to give credit or not. So I think I now see great opportunities there. I think healthcare, fintech will occupy a good part of the next 5 years in terms of like the startups we'll be saying.
Thanks, Innocent. Andreas?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many applications of AI, machine learning, and it's so hard to see where things could grow. But one of the things I'm most excited about, I think, is tying AI to the kind of energy revolution and more distributed, cleaner energy, helping to address climate change. And so in many countries, there's an opportunity to leapfrog in both areas, I think. So leapfrogging in energy to go more towards kind of distributed solar and wind and so on, and running that on a smart grid, which is very much using AI to help that work, and also enabling individuals to trade, to kind of generate and trade energy between each other, which is often supported by AI and blockchain, enable that process. So that's starting to happen already in places like India, where you've got companies like Intello Labs, not Intello, I think there's another one, Power company.
Power Mitra.
Power Mitra, yeah, thank you, Akanksha. And some really exciting things going on there. So I think, yeah, tying together AI and helping to solve emissions and climate change is a big thing for me.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Andres. I'm not sure if there are questions online. So, I mean, Sam, if there are any questions, but while we are still getting more questions, Anthony, one last question to you. From FCDO's perspective, what do you see? What are your future priorities in this space in particular?
Thanks. I think, I mean, also thinking about your question about the next 5 years, I mean, the impact of COVID-19 will continue to shape, I think, the next few years, and that won't just be in the health sector. It will be, in all walks of life, all over the world, even long after vaccines find their way to all different communities. And I think AI has a really important role to play in helping to rebuild and recover from COVID-19 and to build back better, build more resilient systems and smarter ways of doing things. And so I think there's real opportunity there, both in the healthcare space. COVID-19 has driven acceleration of digitization in emerging economies. We're seeing this happen, acceleration of adoption of digital identity systems and things that will have far-reaching implications and impacts on people's lives. So I think it's really important to focus on these, managing the opportunities and risks successfully in the way that AI is applied in those cases, and that could have huge benefits in the longer term.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I would like to close the panel discussion now and move the floor to Sam to see if there are any questions that we've received online or just to wrap the session up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Akanksha, and thanks, Andreas, Anthony, and Innocent. The questions that we got from the chat was a question on did you find geographic trends in terms of sectors some AI use cases more common in certain areas than others? And the response to this is yes, we did find some interesting trends. In terms of sub-Saharan Africa, as I noted in the chat, healthcare and food and agriculture were the top sectors. For North Africa, healthcare as well came out on top, and retail and consumer goods. When we look at South Asia, healthcare and food and agriculture were dominant sectors. Closely, education also came up on top. In Southeast Asia, there was the business intelligence and analytics being one, and financial services as well. Food and agriculture as well came up on top. So that's one question. The other question was, does the sample included AI and machine learning solution, or only AI? So yes, it did include AI and machine learning solution. I think that's it. Those are the questions that we got. Just want to thank you all for attending the session. We hope you found it helpful. I would like to thank our panelists as well, Anthony, Andreas, Innocent. We thank you for sharing your insights on AI. And yeah, we hope to share more insights and research on AI as we're planning for the year ahead. And thank you so much for your time, and please stay in touch.